Earl Johnson's weathered hands froze mid-motion as he knelt beside the dying lioness, her labored breathing the only sound cutting through Montana's pre-dawn silence. Blood stained his calloused fingers. The voice behind him wasn't supposed to exist. "Hello, Dad." Earl's coffee-stained thermos crashed to the rocky ground, hot liquid spreading like spilled secrets across the dirt. The lioness whimpered, three unborn cubs fighting for life inside her swollen belly, while her mate paced restlessly nearby, golden eyes reflecting the rising sun. 20 years of grief collapsed in an instant. Earl had buried this voice, mourned it, carved it into Martha's headstone alongside hers. His son was dead, had been dead since the day Earl failed him. "Turn around slowly, old man." The stranger's boots crunched closer on gravel. "We need to talk." Earl's military training screamed warnings, but his father's heart whispered impossible hope. The lioness convulsed beneath his trembling touch, pulling him back to the moment. Who was this ghost from his past? And why had fate brought him here, now, when Earl was fighting to save the only family he had left? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months before that blood-soaked dawn, Earl Johnson had been just another forgotten widower rattling around in a house built for laughter. The two-story ranch home in Glacier County, Montana, still echoed with ghosts, Martha's humming from the kitchen, little footsteps that belonged to a son who'd vanished into thin air 20 years ago. At 72, Earl carried himself like the decorated Vietnam veteran he was, shoulders squared despite the arthritis gnawing at his joints. His daily routine had calcified into ritual. Black coffee at 5:30, checking the fence lines by 6, feeding the sanctuary animals by 7. The wildlife preserve had started as Martha's dream back when they thought they'd grow old surrounded by grandchildren. Now it served as Earl's penance. "Back in my day, a man's word meant something," he'd mutter to the rescued bears and elk, the only audience left for his lectures about honor and duty. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd kept his word to everyone except the people who mattered most. The medical bills still arrived monthly, cruel reminders of Martha's final battle with cancer 3 years ago. Earl would stack them beside the unopened letters from the bank, the foreclosure notices he pretended didn't exist. Pride had always been his weakness, and now it was slowly strangling what remained of his world. The phone calls had started 3 weeks ago, always the same gravelly voice, always the same demand. "You owe me, Johnson. Time to pay up." Earl would hang up, pour another whiskey, and stare at the empty chair where Martha used to sit with her crossword puzzles. He'd survived Charlie Company in the Mekong Delta, but loneliness was proving a more persistent enemy. Marcus Sterling's name first appeared in Earl's life through a certified letter. The return address bore the logo of Sterling Wildlife Solutions, a company Earl had never heard of, demanding payment for services rendered. The amount made Earl's pension check look like pocket change. When he called the number, that same voice answered, speaking with an educated precision that somehow made the threats more chilling. "You took something from me, old man. Something I can never get back." Earl had racked his brain trying to remember any business dealings gone wrong, any debts forgotten. His memory wasn't what it used to be, but he'd have remembered owing someone $50,000. The caller seemed to know details about the ranch, about Martha's illness, about things no stranger should know. Sleep became elusive. Earl would patrol the property at night, his old service pistol tucked in his waistband, watching for headlights that never came. The animals sensed his tension. The rescued wolf pacing restlessly, the rehabilitating eagles screeching warnings at shadows. The sanctuary was all he had left of the man he'd once hoped to be. If Marcus Sterling wanted to take that too, he'd find out that this old soldier still had some fight left in him. But Earl couldn't shake the feeling that this stranger's vendetta ran deeper than money. The voice carried something personal, something that made Earl's chest tighten with a familiar guilt he'd been running from for 2 decades. The Lioness arrived on a Tuesday that felt heavy with approaching storm clouds. Earl first spotted the pair through his binoculars from the kitchen window, 2 golden shapes moving with careful precision along the tree line bordering his property. Lions weren't native to Montana, which meant these animals had either escaped from somewhere or been deliberately released. The female was visibly pregnant, her swollen belly making her gait awkward as she followed her mate through the tall grass. The male was magnificent, easily 400 pounds of muscle and instinct, his dark mane catching the afternoon light like spun copper. But it was the way they moved together that caught Earl's attention. There was something almost human in their devotion. The way the male would pause whenever his mate needed rest. The gentle way he'd nuzzle her neck when she struggled. Earl's phone rang as he watched them settle beneath the old oak tree near his north pasture. The caller ID showed only numbers, but he recognized the voice immediately. "Beautiful animals, aren't they?" Marcus Sterling's words carried a smugness that made Earl's jaw clench. "Leah's due any day now. Leo's been quite protective during her pregnancy." "How do you know about—" Earl started, but the line went dead. Earl's hands shook as he set down the phone. He grabbed his rifle from the gun cabinet, checked the load, then thought better of it. If Sterling was watching his property, threatening the animals would only escalate things. Instead, he pulled on his jacket and walked outside, moving slowly so as not to spook the lions. The male rose to his feet as Earl approached, a low rumble building in his chest. But there was no immediate aggression, just wariness. The female lifted her head from where she'd been resting, her golden eyes meeting Earl's with an intelligence that took his breath away. "Easy there, Leo," Earl said softly, using the name Sterling had mentioned. "I'm not here to hurt anybody." Something in his tone must have conveyed his intentions because the male settled back down, though his eyes never left Earl's face. The female, Leah, made a soft, chuffing sound that almost sounded like gratitude. Earl spent the next hour observing them from a respectful distance. Leah was clearly in discomfort, shifting positions frequently and panting despite the cool weather. Her pregnancy was advanced, probably within days of delivery. Leo remained vigilant, occasionally standing to scan the horizon before returning to his mate's side. As the sun began to set, Earl made a decision that would have horrified any wildlife expert. He walked back to the house and returned with a bucket of fresh water and some of the venison he kept for feeding the sanctuary's carnivores. He set both items down about 20 feet from the lions and retreated. Leo approached cautiously, sniffed the offerings, then began to drink. Only after he'd determined the water was safe did he allow Leah to approach. She drank deeply, her flanks heaving with the effort of supporting her unborn cubs. That night, Earl barely slept. Every sound from outside sent him to the window to check on his unexpected guests. They'd moved closer to the house, settling in the shelter of the barn's overhang. The practical part of Earl's mind screamed that he was being foolish, harboring dangerous predators on his property. But another part, the part that had been hollow since Martha died, recognized something kindred in their fierce devotion to each other. The next morning brought another call from Sterling. This time his voice carried an edge of urgency. "Time's running out, Johnson. I'll be there tomorrow night to collect what's mine. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "What do you want from me?" Earl demanded. "If it's money, I don't have it." "The ranch is mortgaged to the hilt, and I'm barely keeping food on the table." Sterling's laugh was bitter. "You really don't remember, do you? 20 years, old man? 20 years I've been looking for you, and you don't even remember what you took from me." The line went dead again, leaving Earl staring at the phone with growing dread. 20 years ago. That would have been around the time his son Michael had. Earl's mind shied away from that particular pain. Some wounds never healed, they just learned to hide better. Outside, Leah was pacing restlessly, while Leo watched her with obvious concern. Even from the house, Earl could see the distress in her movements. Labor was beginning, and something was wrong. Earl grabbed his veterinary supplies, a remnant from his brief attempt at ranching before the sanctuary became his life, and headed outside. Whatever Sterling wanted, whatever debt he claimed Earl owed, it would have to wait. Right now, a mother needed help bringing her babies into the world. As he knelt beside the laboring Lioness, Earl couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to pay for sins he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Dawn broke gray and unforgiving over the Montana landscape as Earl knelt beside Leah, whose labored breathing had worsened throughout the night. Her contractions had been going for nearly 18 hours now, far too long for any mammal to safely deliver. Leo paced in tight circles around them, his agitation growing with each of his mate's pained whimpers. Earl had delivered calves during his brief ranching days, even helped birth a few foals, but lions were different beasts entirely. Their anatomy, their instincts, the sheer danger of being this close to a 400-pound predator protecting his mate. It all pushed against every survival instinct Earl had developed over 7 decades of living. "Come on, girl," he whispered, his arthritic hands gentle on her flank. "You can do this." Leah's golden eyes found his, and in them Earl saw something that stopped his breath: trust. Complete, inexplicable trust from a wild animal that should have seen him as either threat or irrelevance. It reminded him of the way Martha used to look at him during her worst days in the hospital. That same faith that somehow, some way, he'd find a solution. The sound of engines rumbling up his gravel drive made Leo's head snap toward the road. Earl counted 3 vehicles, maybe 4, moving slowly like a funeral procession. His stomach dropped as he recognized the deliberate pace of men who weren't in a hurry because they knew their quarry had nowhere to run. Marcus Sterling stepped out of the lead vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows that screamed government or worse. He was younger than Earl had expected, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of lean build that suggested military training. His face was all sharp angles and cold calculation, but there was something else there, something that made Earl's chest tighten with recognition he couldn't quite place. "Step away from the animals, old man." Sterling's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. 3 men flanked him, all carrying weapons they weren't bothering to conceal. Earl stayed where he was, one hand on Leah's heaving side. "She's dying. Whatever you want from me, it can wait until after I help her." Sterling's laugh was harsh as winter wind. How noble, the great Earl Johnson, always ready to save something except when it mattered most. The words hit Earl like a physical blow. There was too much knowledge behind them, too much personal venom for this to be about money or business deals gone wrong. Sterling moved closer, and Earl caught sight of something that made his blood run cold, a small scar above the man's left eyebrow, shaped like a crescent moon. Michael had gotten that scar falling off his bike when he was 7. Earl had been the one to hold him while Martha cleaned the wound, promising it would barely leave a mark. He'd been wrong about that, just like he'd been wrong about so many things. "You're not—" Earl's voice cracked like autumn leaves. "You can't be." "Michael died 20 years ago," Sterling said, his tone flat as cemetery stone. "The day his father chose duty over family, the day Earl Johnson decided the army needed him more than his dying wife and terrified son." Earl's world tilted sideways. The man standing before him wore his son's face, carried his son's scar, but everything else was wrong. The Michael he remembered had been gentle, bookish, more likely to rescue injured birds than threaten anyone with violence. This Sterling character was hard-edged, dangerous, speaking with the calculated precision of someone who'd learned to weaponize words. "Michael's dead," Earl whispered, the words he'd been telling himself for 2 decades. He ran away after the funeral. Social services looked for months. Social services looked for a scared 15-year-old kid, Sterling corrected. They didn't look for someone who learned to disappear. Someone who had to become someone else to survive. Leah's pained cry cut through the tension like a blade. Her contractions were getting stronger but less productive, a sign that the cubs were stuck. Earl forced himself to focus on the immediate crisis, even as his mind reeled from revelations that rewrote his entire understanding of the last 20 years. "We can sort out our family drama later," Earl said, reaching for his veterinary kit. "Right now she needs help." Sterling raised his weapon, a military-style rifle that looked government issue. "The only thing that animal needs is a bullet. I'm here for what you owe me, not to watch you play veterinarian." Leo's response was immediate and terrifying. The male lion launched himself between Earl and the gunman, 400 pounds of protective fury landing with earth-shaking impact. His roar split the morning air, a sound so primal and powerful that 2 of Sterling's men actually took steps backward. But what happened next defied everything Earl knew about wild animal behavior. Instead of attacking, Leo positioned himself as a living shield between Earl and the weapons, his massive head turned toward Sterling with eyes that held no fear, only challenge. "Well, I'll be damned," one of Sterling's men muttered. "That cat's protecting the old guy." Sterling's face showed the first crack in his composure. "Animals don't choose sides. They don't understand loyalty." Earl found his voice, his hands never stopping their gentle examination of Leah's condition. "Maybe they understand it better than people do. Maybe they know the difference between someone who helps and someone who hurts." The standoff stretched taut as wire, broken only by Leah's increasingly desperate sounds. Time was running out for the cubs, and Earl could see in Leo's eyes the same desperate helplessness he'd felt watching Martha slip away in that sterile hospital room, the same helplessness that had driven his son away and brought him back as a stranger hungry for revenge. Earl looked up at the man who claimed to be Michael, seeing his son's face twisted by 20 years of anger and survival. "If you're really my boy, then you know I never stopped looking for you." Earl's hands moved with practiced precision as he prepared the emergency birthing kit, his military training kicking in despite the emotional chaos swirling around him. 20 years of veterinary experience with sanctuary animals had taught him that crisis demanded focus, not sentiment. Leah's breathing was becoming more labored, her golden coat slick with perspiration as she fought to bring her cubs into the world. "You always were good at ignoring what mattered most," Sterling said, his rifle still trained on Earl but his voice carrying something new, a tremor that spoke of old wounds poorly healed. "Even now, with a gun pointed at you, you're more concerned about some wild animal than your own flesh and blood." Earl didn't look up from his work, his fingers gently probing Leah's condition. The first cub was positioned wrong, breech presentation that could kill both mother and offspring if not corrected quickly. "Maybe because this wild animal never chose to disappear for 20 years, he said quietly. "Never chose to break her father's heart and then come back looking for revenge." Leo remained positioned between Earl and the gunman, his massive frame tense but controlled. The lion's behavior continued to baffle Sterling's men, who shifted nervously as they tried to maintain their weapons' aim around 400 pounds of apex predator. "You want to know about choices?" Sterling's voice cracked like a whip. "Let me tell you about choices, old man. 15 years old, watching Mom waste away in a hospital bed while you played soldier on the other side of the world. Listening to her call your name in her sleep, begging you to come home. That's when I learned what your choices really meant." Earl's hands stilled for a moment. Martha had never told him about those final weeks, had insisted in their brief phone calls that she was managing fine, that Michael was handling everything like a man. The Army had needed him for one last mission, a classified operation that would secure his full pension and benefits. He'd promised to be home for Christmas. He'd kept that promise, arriving just in time to bury his wife and find his son gone. "She made me promise not to tell you how bad it was," Earl whispered, the memory of Martha's final letter burning in his chest. "Said you'd desert if you knew, and she couldn't live with destroying your honor along with everything else." Sterling's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Honor? You call abandoning your family honor? I held her hand when she died, Earl, 15 years old, and I was the only one there to tell her goodbye." The words hit Earl like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at the guilt he'd carried for 2 decades. He forced himself to continue working on Leah, using the familiar routine of helping birth new life to anchor himself against the storm of revelation and regret. "The mission was classified," Earl said, his voice thick with justification that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Strategic importance. If I'd known—" "You would have found an excuse anyway," Sterling cut him off. "Just like you found excuses every time I needed you growing up. Just like you're finding excuses now, playing with your zoo animals instead of facing what you did to your real family." Leah suddenly convulsed, a violent contraction that made Leo whine in distress. Earl could feel the first cub's position shifting slightly. Progress, but not enough. He needed to manually reposition the offspring, a dangerous procedure that required the mother to remain calm despite the pain. "Leo," Earl said softly, looking up at the massive male. "I need her to stay still." "Can you help me, big guy?" What happened next defied every scientific paper Earl had ever read about wild animal behavior. Leo moved to Leah's head and began making low, rumbling sounds. Not quite purring, but something deeper, more primal. Leah's breathing slowed slightly, her eyes closing as she seemed to draw comfort from her mate's presence. "Impossible," muttered one of Sterling's men, a wiry individual with prison tattoos covering his forearms. "Lions don't do that. Wild animals don't cooperate with humans." Sterling's face showed the first crack in his cold composure. "Shut up, Briggs. They're just animals." But Earl could see the doubt creeping into his son's eyes, or the man who claimed to be his son. 20 years was a long time, long enough for a boy to become a stranger, long enough for love to curdle into something unrecognizable. Earl gently inserted his hand into Leah's birth canal, feeling for the cub's position. The tiny form was indeed breech, its hind legs tangled in the umbilical cord. One wrong move could strangle the cub or cause Leah to hemorrhage. His arthritic fingers, steady despite 7 decades of use, began the delicate process of repositioning the offspring. "Tell me about the 20 years, Earl said, partly to distract himself from the procedure and partly because he needed to know what had become of his boy. "Tell me how Michael Johnson became Marcus Sterling." "Michael Johnson died the day he realized his father cared more about strangers than family," Sterling replied, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Marcus Sterling was born in a group home in Billings, learned to fight for every scrap of food and dignity, learned that trust is a luxury only the naive can afford." Earl felt the cub shift, its position improving slightly. Leah's contractions were helping now instead of hindering. And the wildlife business? How does a kid from a group home end up trafficking exotic animals? Sterling's eyes flickered with something that might have been shame. Started small, smuggling rare birds for collectors who didn't want to wait for legal permits. Discovered I had a talent for reading animals, understanding what they needed. Turns out abandoned kids and caged animals have a lot in common. "So you became what you hated," Earl said, feeling the cub's head crown. "Turned creatures into commodities just like you felt I'd done to you." "Don't you dare psychoanalyze me," Sterling snapped, but his rifle had lowered slightly. "You lost the right to father me the day you chose duty over family." Leah suddenly pushed, a massive contraction that sent the first cub sliding into Earl's waiting hands. The tiny lion was perfectly formed but eerily still. No breathing, no movement. Earl immediately began clearing the airways, his fingers working frantically to stimulate life into the motionless form. "Come on, baby," he whispered, rubbing the cub's chest with his thumb. "Come on, breathe for me." Leo and Leah both watched intently, their parental instincts engaged despite the surreal circumstances. Even Sterling's men had lowered their weapons slightly, drawn into the drama of life and death playing out before them. "Is it?" Sterling started to ask, then caught himself, as if caring about the outcome would betray some crucial principle. Earl continued working on the cub, alternating between chest compressions and airway clearing. Suddenly, the tiny form shuddered, took a gasping breath, and began mewing weakly. Leo rumbled with what could only be described as relief, while Leah immediately began the instinctive process of cleaning her offspring. "One down," Earl said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Two more to go." The second cub arrived more easily, sliding into the world with the efficiency of nature working as intended. This one was immediately vocal, its cries mixing with its siblings to create a symphony of new life that seemed to soften even the hardest faces among Sterling's crew. But the third cub was in trouble. Earl could feel it during the delivery. Too small, arriving too late, its tiny form already showing signs of distress. Despite his best efforts, the third offspring never took its first breath, remaining still and cold in his hands despite every technique he knew. The silence that followed was profound. Leah sniffed at her motionless cub, making soft sounds that seemed to transcend species barriers. Every parent in the world would recognize that sound, the keen of loss, the bewilderment of love that couldn't overcome biology. "Life isn't fair," Earl said quietly, gently placing the stillborn cub where Leah could see it. "Sometimes you do everything right and still lose what matters most." Sterling's face had gone pale, his rifle now hanging loosely at his side. "Just like that? It's just gone?" "Just like that," Earl confirmed, his own voice thick with 20 years of similar losses. "Just like your mother. Just like the son I thought I'd lost forever." The admission hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire. For the first time since arriving, Sterling looked uncertain, the hard edges of his anger blunted by the reality of mortality playing out before them. "The difference is," Earl continued, stroking Leah's head as she mourned her lost cub, "Leah here still has Leo, still has two healthy babies who need her. She won't let grief for one destroy her love for the others." The moment stretched between father and son like a bridge built of 20 years' worth of unspoken words. Sterling's rifle hung forgotten at his side as he watched Leah gently nudge her surviving cubs closer to her warmth. The two healthy offspring, barely minutes old, instinctively began searching for milk, their tiny mews creating a soundtrack of hope against the backdrop of loss. Earl carefully moved the stillborn cub to a respectful distance, wrapping it in a clean towel from his veterinary kit. Leo approached the small bundle, sniffed once, then returned to his mate and living offspring. Even in the animal kingdom, Earl observed, grief had its place, but couldn't be allowed to overshadow the responsibility to the living. "You named them," Sterling said suddenly, his voice stripped of its earlier venom. "Before they were even born, you already cared enough to give them names." "Leah means weary in Hebrew," Earl replied, his hands gentle as he helped position the cubs for their first feeding. Seemed fitting for a mother who'd traveled so far to find safety. "Leo means lion. Simple, honest, no pretense." Sterling's laugh was hollow. "Unlike Marcus Sterling, you mean? Unlike the pretense I've been living for 20 years? Earl finally looked up at his son, and despite everything, despite the weapons and threats and years of separation, he could see Michael in the man's eyes. The same hazel green that had once looked up at him with hero worship, now clouded with pain and anger, but unmistakably his boy's. "I never stopped looking for you," Earl said quietly. "Even after the police gave up, even after the social workers closed your case. I hired private investigators, posted on missing persons websites, followed every lead that came my way. Your mother made me promise to find you before she died." Sterling's composure cracked visibly. "She was already dying when you left for that last mission. 3 months the doctors gave her, and you chose to spend them playing soldier instead of being a husband." The accusation hit Earl like a physical blow because it carried the weight of truth. He had known Martha was sick, terminal, the doctors had said, but the mission briefing had painted a picture of strategic necessity that his military-trained mind couldn't ignore. Classified operations in Central America, the kind of work that would secure his family's financial future through enhanced benefits and pension qualifications. "She told me to go," Earl said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said the mission was too important, that she could handle 3 months on her own. Said she'd rather have a dead hero than a live coward." "That's Mom, all right," Sterling said bitterly. "Always protecting your pride, even when it was killing her. Did you know she sold her grandmother's ring to pay for experimental treatment? Did you know she worked double shifts at the diner right up until the week she died, just to keep food on the table?" Each revelation was another knife twist in Earl's chest. Martha had hidden the extent of their financial struggles, had maintained the fiction that everything was manageable until his return. Her letters had been full of optimism and strength, never mentioning the mounting medical bills or the desperate measures she'd taken to keep their family afloat. "The mission was classified," Earl repeated, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "I couldn't tell her the real details, couldn't explain why it was so important." Sterling's eyes blazed with renewed anger. "More important than watching your wife die? More important than being there when your 15-year-old son had to make decisions about life support and funeral arrangements?" Leo suddenly raised his head, a low warning growl rumbling in his chest. His attention was focused not on the humans but on something beyond the immediate group. Earl followed the lion's gaze and spotted movement in the tree line, more vehicles approaching, these bearing official government plates. "Expecting company?" Sterling asked, his professional instincts overriding personal emotion as he raised his rifle again. Earl shook his head, but his stomach dropped as he recognized the lead vehicle. Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, accompanied by what looked like local law enforcement. Someone had reported the presence of exotic animals on his property, and the cavalry was arriving with tranquilizer guns and transport cages. "We need to move them," Earl said urgently, looking at the newborn cubs who were far too young to survive transport or captivity. "Leah can't be moved yet, and those babies won't survive in a government facility." Sterling's men immediately took defensive positions, their weapons trained on the approaching convoy. The mathematical reality of the situation was stark. 4 men with rifles against a coordinated law enforcement operation was a losing proposition, especially with innocent animals caught in the crossfire. "This is what you do, isn't it?" Earl said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "You don't just traffic animals. You steal them from places where they'll be destroyed or imprisoned. You're some kind of twisted Robin Hood." Sterling's jaw tightened. "Those cubs won't live 48 hours in a federal facility. They'll be separated from their parents, hand-raised by technicians who think love is a feeding schedule. If they're lucky, they'll end up in a zoo. If they're not lucky..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Earl had seen enough government animal control operations to know that euthanasia for public safety was often the first resort, not the last. The lead federal vehicle stopped about 50 yards away, and agents began deploying with the precision of a military operation. Earl could see tranquilizer rifles, transport cages, and enough firepower to handle any resistance. Leo positioned himself protectively over his family, his massive frame tense with the awareness that escape was no longer an option. "There's a cave system about 2 miles north," Earl said quickly, "connected to the old mine shafts. The entrance is hidden behind a rockfall, but if you know where to look—" Sterling stared at his father in amazement. "You're helping me steal federal evidence. You, the by-the-book soldier boy who never bent a rule in his life?" Earl looked down at Leah, exhausted from her ordeal but already cleaning her cubs with fierce maternal devotion. Leo's eyes met his, and in them Earl saw the same desperate love he'd felt watching Martha fight for every extra day, every precious moment with their family. "Sometimes the rules are wrong," Earl said, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of painful lessons. "Sometimes love matters more than law." The federal agents were setting up a perimeter, their movements suggesting they planned a slow, careful approach. Earl estimated maybe 10 minutes before they'd be close enough to use the tranquilizer guns effectively. "The north pasture gate is hidden by the old barn," Earl continued. "Keys under the third fence post. Trail leads through the canyon. It's rough, but a good 4-wheel drive can make it." The cave entrance is marked with 3 stacked stones. Sterling looked at his father with something approaching wonder. "Why? After everything, why would you help me?" Earl gently lifted one of the newborn cubs, marveling at its perfect miniature features, the tiny paws that would someday grow into powerful weapons, the closed eyes that would open to see a world where survival depended on the kindness of strangers. "Because 20 years ago, I chose duty over family and lost everything that mattered," Earl said. "I won't make that mistake again. Not when I've got a chance to save something precious." Leo rumbled softly, as if sensing the conversation's importance. Leah looked up at Earl with those golden eyes, and in them he saw not just trust, but gratitude. These animals understood sacrifice, understood the difference between those who helped and those who hunted. Sterling hesitated for a moment longer, then made his decision. "Briggs, get the transport ready. We're moving the package to the alternate location." "What about the old man?" Briggs asked, gesturing toward Earl. Sterling looked at his father, 20 years of anger warring with something deeper, something that remembered bedtime stories and piggyback rides, and a time when Earl Johnson had been the strongest, bravest man in the world. "He's coming with us," Sterling said finally. "Someone needs to monitor the cubs during transport, and he's the only one here with veterinary experience." Earl felt his heart skip a beat. Going with Sterling meant becoming a fugitive, abandoning everything he'd built in Montana, throwing away his remaining years of peaceful retirement. It also meant staying close to his son, protecting these magnificent creatures, and maybe, just maybe, finding a way to bridge 20 years of pain and misunderstanding. The sound of federal boots crunching on gravel was getting closer. Leo gathered his family, preparing for whatever came next. Earl made his choice. The cave system was older than Earl's grandfather's stories, carved by ancient water and time into a labyrinth that stretched deep into the Montana mountainside. Sterling's men had arrived there ahead of them, setting up what appeared to be a sophisticated temporary shelter complete with veterinary equipment that put Earl's ranch supplies to shame. "How long have you been planning this?" Earl asked as they carefully transferred Leah and her cubs into the climate-controlled environment. The Lioness was exhausted but alert, her maternal instincts keeping her focused on her offspring despite the strange surroundings. 3 months, Sterling replied, his voice carrying a pride he tried to hide. "Ever since I learned about your little sanctuary operation. Amazing what kind of intelligence you can gather when you know the right people to ask." Earl felt the pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. "You've been watching me, planning this whole operation around my property, using me as bait to draw out the federal response." Sterling's smile was sharp as broken glass. The great Earl Johnson, always thinking he's the center of the universe. This was never about you, old man. It was about saving 24 exotic animals from a corrupt breeding facility in Nevada. Your ranch just happened to be a convenient staging area. The words hit Earl like physical blows, but it was the casual cruelty behind them that truly staggered him. His son had returned not out of love or longing for family, but as part of an elaborate criminal operation that used Earl's genuine care for animals as a cover for theft and trafficking. 24? Earl's voice was barely a whisper. "What have you done?" Briggs, the tattooed man who seemed to serve as Sterling's lieutenant, gestured toward the deeper recesses of the cave. "Want to see your handiwork, Pops? See what your boy's been up to while you were playing saint with your little petting zoo?" The deeper chamber revealed an underground Noah's Ark of stolen magnificence. Earl counted tigers, leopards, a pair of young elephants, several species of exotic birds, and animals he couldn't immediately identify. All appeared healthy, well cared for, but the legal implications of what he was seeing made his head spin. "These animals were scheduled for destruction," Sterling said, his voice defensive. "Seized from private collectors who couldn't prove legal acquisition. The government was going to euthanize them rather than spend money on proper facilities." "So you stole them," Earl said flatly. "You became everything you accused me of being, someone who takes what doesn't belong to them and justifies it with noble intentions." Sterling's composure finally cracked completely. "Noble intentions? You want to talk about noble intentions?" "Let me tell you about noble intentions, Dad." "Let me tell you about spending your 15th birthday in a group home because your father's noble intentions were more important than his dying wife." Earl sank onto a camp chair someone had set up near Leah's makeshift den. The lioness was nursing her cubs, oblivious to the human drama unfolding around her. Leo lay nearby, still vigilant but trusting enough to rest while his family was safe. "You're right," Earl said quietly. "I made choices that hurt the people I loved most. But this isn't the answer, Michael. This isn't how you honor your mother's memory." "Don't you dare bring Mom into this," Sterling snarled. "You lost the right to speak about her the day you chose strangers over family." Earl felt the weight of 20 years settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Every choice he'd made since Martha's death had been an attempt to atone for his absence, to save something when he'd failed to save the things that mattered most. The sanctuary, the rescued animals, even his willingness to help birth Leah's cubs, all of it was penance for a sin he couldn't undo. "She wrote me letters," Earl said, his voice thick with memory. "Every week while I was on that final mission. Never mentioned how sick she was, never told me about the bills or the pain or how scared you were. Just wrote about how proud she was, how much she loved me, how she couldn't wait for me to come home." Sterling's face went pale. "She what?" "I kept them all," Earl continued. "Every single letter, stored in the desk drawer where she used to keep her crossword puzzles. She made it sound like she was getting better, like the treatments were working. Said you were handling everything like a man, that she was proud of how strong you'd become." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sounds of the newborn cubs nursing and Leo's contented rumbling. Sterling stared at his father as if seeing him for the first time, his angry certainty beginning to crack around the edges. "She was protecting you," Sterling said finally, his voice hollow. "Even while she was dying, she was still protecting your feelings." "And I was protecting yours," Earl replied. "That last mission, it wasn't classified military work. It was private security, bodyguard duty for some weapons contractor's family in Colombia. The pay was 3 times my military salary, enough to cover all of Martha's medical bills and set up a college fund for you." Sterling's weapon clattered to the cave floor. "You're lying," Earl pulled out his wallet, extracted a yellowed piece of paper that had lived there for 20 years. Payment stub from Blackwater Security Services, $60,000 for 3 months' work. I was supposed to come home with enough money to save your mother and give you a future. Sterling took the paper with shaking hands, studying the faded ink and official letterhead. But she died anyway. All that money, all that time away, and she died anyway. Cancer doesn't care how much money you throw at it, Earl said softly. Sometimes love isn't enough to save the people we care about. Sometimes all we can do is try to honor their memory by saving what we can. Briggs cleared his throat from the cave entrance. Boss, we've got company. Federal task force is setting up a perimeter around the whole mountain. They're not going away this time. Sterling looked around the cave at the animals they'd rescued, at the elaborate operation he'd built to save creatures that society had deemed expendable. Earl could see the weight of responsibility settling on his son's shoulders, the same burden of impossible choices that had defined Earl's own life. They'll kill them all, Sterling said quietly. Every single animal in here will be destroyed as evidence in a federal prosecution. 2 years of work, dozens of lives saved, all of it gone because I couldn't let go of 20-year-old anger. Earl stood up, his arthritis protesting after hours of sitting in the damp cave. Maybe it's time to stop running from the past and start building a future. What are you talking about? Earl looked at Leah and her cubs, at Leo's protective vigilance, at the other rescued animals living on borrowed time in their underground sanctuary. Your mother didn't write those letters to protect my feelings. She wrote them to protect my hope. She knew that if I came home to despair, I'd never recover. She wanted me to come home to possibility. Sterling's eyes were bright with unshed tears. It's too late for possibility, Dad. I'm a federal fugitive running an illegal animal trafficking operation. You're now an accessory to everything I've done. We're both going to spend whatever years we have left in prison. Earl smiled for the first time since the ordeal began. Son, you're thinking like a criminal instead of thinking like a Johnson. Your grandfather used to say that the difference between a problem and an opportunity is whether you're looking backward or forward. What's that supposed to mean? Earl gestured toward the cave entrance where the sound of helicopters was growing louder. It means we stop running and start negotiating. It means we turn this from a criminal enterprise into a legitimate rescue operation. It means we give these animals what they really need, not hidden caves and stolen time, but proper facilities and legal protection. Sterling looked at his father as if he'd lost his mind. You want to surrender? Just walk out there and hope the federal government suddenly develops a conscience about animal welfare? I want to bet everything on the possibility that love can still win, Earl said. Your mother's love, our love for these animals, and maybe, if we're very lucky, whatever love might still exist between a father and son who've both made terrible mistakes. The sound of approaching boots echoed through the cave system. Time had run out for running, for hiding, for 20 years of anger and regret. Earl reached out his hand toward his son, palm up, offering not demands or expectations but simple possibility. What do you say, Michael? Ready to come home? Sterling stared at his father's outstretched hand as if it were a live grenade. 20 years of carefully constructed hatred warred with memories he'd tried to bury. Piggyback rides through wheat fields, bedtime stories about brave soldiers coming home to their families, the smell of his father's aftershave and the rough warmth of his hands teaching a small boy how to tie fishing knots. You don't understand, Sterling said, his voice breaking. There's something else, something I haven't told you. Earl's hand remained steady, waiting. Around them, the rescued animals seemed to sense the emotional intensity, several of the big cats making soft vocalizations that filled the cave with an almost otherworldly chorus. Mom didn't die of cancer, Sterling whispered, the words tearing from his throat like shards of glass. That's what I told myself for years. what I needed to believe to keep hating you, but the truth is so much worse." Earl's face went white. "What are you saying?" Sterling pulled a manila envelope from his jacket, its edges worn from years of handling. Inside were medical records, official documents, and photographs that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. "She died by suicide, Dad, 3 days after receiving your last letter about the mission being extended." The cave fell silent, except for the sound of Earl's ragged breathing. Even Leo lifted his massive head, sensing the shift in emotional temperature. Earl's outstretched hand began to tremble as Sterling continued his devastating revelation. The cancer was in remission, had been for 6 weeks. The experimental treatment worked, but the medical bills had destroyed everything. We lost the house, lost the car, lost everything except the clothes on our backs. She was living in a studio apartment above the diner where she worked, sleeping on a mattress on the floor. Earl's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the camp chair as if Sterling had physically struck him. "No, that's not... Martha wouldn't..." "She would, and she did," Sterling said, his voice now cold with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed these words 1,000 times. "Left me a note saying she couldn't bear to watch you come home to nothing. Said you deserve better than a wife who'd failed to keep your family together. Said maybe without her dragging you down, you and I could have a fresh start." The manila envelope contained photographs that made Earl's world crumble completely. Martha in that tiny apartment, surrounded by unpaid bills and eviction notices. Martha at her diner job, working double shifts to pay for a studio apartment she couldn't afford. Martha writing her cheerful letters to Earl while sitting on a mattress that served as her only furniture. "She wrote those letters to protect you," Sterling continued relentlessly. "Made up stories about how well we were doing, how proud she was, how everything was going to be fine when you came home. She died believing those lies were an act of love." Earl stared at the photographs with eyes that seemed to age decades in moments. There was Martha's handwriting on bills marked "Final Notice." There was Martha's signature on a lease for the studio apartment. There was Martha's suicide note, addressed to a son who was about to lose everything he'd ever known. "Why didn't you tell me?" Earl's voice was barely audible. "When I came home, when I was searching for you, why didn't you tell me the truth?" Sterling's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "Because I was 15 and angry, and I wanted you to suffer like I was suffering. I wanted you to believe she died thinking you were a hero, instead of knowing she died thinking she was a failure." The sound of federal agents moving through the outer cave chambers was getting closer. Flashlight beams began probing the darkness, and radio chatter echoed off the stone walls. But both men seemed frozen in the aftermath of Sterling's revelation. 20 years of mutual destruction laid bare between them. "There's more," Sterling said, his voice now barely a whisper. "The money from your mission, the $60,000? Earl looked up with eyes that held no hope for good news. "It came 3 days too late. The bank transfer arrived the morning after her funeral. $60,000, sitting in an account that belonged to a dead woman who died believing she was worthless." Earl made a sound that was part sob, part scream, a noise that seemed to come from someplace deeper than grief. Leo rose to his feet, padding over to the broken man and laying his massive head against Earl's shoulder in a gesture that transcended species. The lion's warmth was solid, real, offering comfort in a moment when human words had no power to heal. "So you took the money," Earl said when he could speak again. "I took every penny," Sterling confirmed. "Used it to disappear, to become someone else, to build a life where Earl Johnson's failures couldn't touch me anymore." "And became exactly what you hated," Earl said, understanding flooding through him. "Someone who takes what doesn't belong to them and justifies it with good intentions." Sterling nodded, tears now flowing freely down his face. The animals were just the beginning. Started small, rescuing dogs from puppy mills, cats from hoarders, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough to fill the hole she left behind. The federal agents were close now, their voices carrying clearly through the cave system. Both men could hear the professional terminology of a coordinated raid: secure the perimeter, tranquilizer teams in position, prepare for multiple suspects. "She would have forgiven you," Earl said suddenly, his voice carrying surprising strength. "Martha would have forgiven both of us for the choices we made." Sterling looked at his father with something approaching wonder. "How can you say that? After everything I've just told you, after all the ways we both failed her, how can you believe in forgiveness?" Earl gestured toward Leah and her cubs, toward Leo's protective presence, toward the other rescued animals living in their underground sanctuary. "Because she taught me that love doesn't keep score. Love doesn't demand perfection. Love just demands that we keep trying to do better." A new voice echoed through the cave, female, authoritative, carrying the unmistakable tone of federal authority. "This is Agent Sarah Chen, Fish and Wildlife Service. We know you're in there. We're prepared to negotiate." Sterling wiped his eyes and picked up his rifle, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim effectively. 20 years of running, and it ends like this, in a cave surrounded by the only family I have left. Earl stood up, his arthritic joints protesting, but his resolve solid. "It doesn't have to end, Michael. It can begin." "What are you talking about?" Earl walked to the cave entrance, his hands raised but his voice carrying clearly. "Agent Chen, this is Earl Johnson. I'm coming out to negotiate. I have information about illegal animal trafficking operations across 7 states, and I'm prepared to cooperate fully in exchange for protective custody for these animals." Sterling stared at his father in amazement. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 20 years ago," Earl replied. "Choosing family over duty, love over pride, hope over fear." Agent Chen's voice carried surprise but professional interest. "Mr. Johnson, are you saying you're willing to testify against the trafficking network?" Earl looked back at his son, at the man Michael had become, at the pain they'd both carried for 2 decades. "I'm saying I'm willing to take responsibility for my choices and help my son take responsibility for his. These animals deserve legal protection, not hidden caves. My son deserves a chance at redemption, not a lifetime of running." Sterling slowly set down his rifle, the weight of 20 years lifting from his shoulders. "They'll send me to prison." "Maybe," Earl agreed. "But you'll go as Michael Johnson, not Marcus Sterling. You'll go as my son, and I'll be there every step of the way." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, but for the first time in decades, neither man was running from the future. Earl reached out his hand again, and this time Sterling took it, father and son united in their decision to face whatever came next together. "Agent Chen," Earl called out, his voice steady with newfound purpose. "We're coming out, all of us, and we're ready to tell you everything." 3 months later, Earl Johnson stood in the morning sunlight outside the federal courthouse in Helena, Montana, watching his son emerge from what would be his final sentencing hearing. Michael, he'd legally reclaimed his birth name during the proceedings, walked with the measured pace of a man who'd finally stopped running from his past. 2 years supervised probation and 500 hours of community service, Michael said, unable to suppress a smile. Agent Chen said it was the lightest sentence in federal trafficking history. Earl clapped his son on the shoulder, marveling at how the simple gesture, father touching son, no longer carried the weight of 20 years' worth of pain and regret. "Turns out cooperation and a willingness to testify against an international smuggling ring carry some weight with federal prosecutors." They walked together toward the parking lot, where Earl's old pickup truck waited, its bed loaded with supplies for the drive back to what was now officially known as Martha's Hope Wildlife Sanctuary. The federal government had not only dropped most charges against Earl, but had granted the facility a special conservation license that made it one of only 12 private sanctuaries in the country authorized to house exotic species seized in trafficking operations. "I still can't believe they're letting us keep them all," Michael said, shaking his head in wonder. "Leah, Leo, the cubs, even the tigers and elephants from the cave." "Agent Chen said something interesting during the final hearing," Earl replied, fishing his keys from his pocket. "She said the government spends over $2 million annually housing seized animals in inadequate facilities. Our proposal to create a legitimate sanctuary saves them money and gives the animals proper care." The transformation of Earl's modest ranch into a world-class wildlife facility had been nothing short of miraculous. Donations had poured in from around the country once the story broke. The elderly veteran and his prodigal son working together to create a refuge for animals that society had written off as worthless. Corporate sponsors had provided funding for veterinary facilities, proper enclosures, and educational programs that now attracted visitors from across the region. But the real miracle was smaller, more personal. It lived in the daily routine of father and son working side by side, building something meaningful from the ashes of their mutual failures. It lived in quiet conversations over morning coffee, in shared responsibilities that required trust and forgiveness, in the simple recognition that love could survive even the deepest wounds. As they drove through the sanctuary gates, Earl spotted the familiar golden forms of Leo and Leah lounging in the shade of their large enclosure. The two surviving cubs, now 3 months old and growing strong, tumbled over their parents in the endless play that characterizes healthy young lions. The third cub, the one that hadn't survived birth, was buried beneath a small memorial stone that read, "Every life matters, no matter how brief." "There's something I need to tell you," Michael said as Earl parked near the main facility. "Something I should have mentioned during all the legal proceedings." Earl's stomach tightened with the familiar fear that another devastating revelation was coming. 20 years of pain had taught him to expect the worst possible news. "The studio apartment," Michael continued, "the one Mom lived in during those final months. I've been paying rent on it all these years, keeping it exactly as she left it." Earl stared at his son in amazement. 20 years? You've maintained her apartment for 20 years? Michael nodded, suddenly looking younger, more like the frightened 15-year-old he'd been when the world collapsed around him. "I couldn't let anyone else live there. Couldn't let them paint over the nail holes where she hung her pictures or replace the linoleum where she spilled coffee while writing you those letters." They sat in silence for a moment, watching Leah groom her cubs with the patient devotion that characterizes motherhood across all species. Earl thought about Martha in that tiny space, working double shifts and sleeping on a mattress on the floor, writing cheerful lies to protect the husband she loved more than her own life. "I want to see it," Earl said finally. "I want to see where she spent her final months." The apartment above Romano's diner was exactly as Michael had described, a shrine to the woman they'd both loved and lost. Martha's clothes still hung in the narrow closet. Her crossword puzzle books still sat on the small table where she'd eaten solitary meals. Her final letter to Earl, the one that had never been sent, lay on the desk where she'd written it. Earl read the letter with shaking hands, Martha's familiar handwriting swimming through his tears. It was filled with the same protective love that had characterized all her correspondence, the same determination to shield him from the reality of their situation. But this final letter contained something the others hadn't: the truth. "My darling Earl," it read, "by the time you read this, I'll be with Jesus, and you and Michael will be free to build a life together without the burden of my failures. I lost our home, lost everything we worked for. but I never lost my faith in the man you are. Take care of our boy. He's angry now, but underneath all that hurt is the same gentle soul who used to rescue injured birds. Love him enough for both of us." The letter was signed, "Your Martha," and dated 3 days before her death. "She was wrong," Earl said, his voice thick with emotion. "She didn't fail us. We failed her by not being strong enough to handle the truth." Michael stood at the window overlooking the diner where Martha had worked, watching the lunch crowd bustle through their daily routines. "I come here every year on the anniversary of her death. Sit in the booth where she used to take her breaks, order the coffee she liked, and try to imagine what she'd think of the man I became." "What do you think she'd say now?" Earl asked. "About the sanctuary, about us working together, about the family we're rebuilding?" Michael smiled through his tears. "I think she'd say we finally figured out what she was trying to teach us all along. That love isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about showing up for each other, especially when it's hard." They spent the afternoon going through Martha's belongings, sharing memories that had been too painful to voice for 20 years. They found photo albums documenting Michael's childhood, love letters Earl had written during his early military deployments, and a journal where Martha had recorded her hopes and dreams for their family's future. As the sun set over Helena, father and son prepared to return to the sanctuary, to the animals that had brought them back together, to the work that gave their lives meaning. The apartment would remain as it was, not as a shrine to guilt and regret, but as a reminder that love endures even when everything else falls apart. Driving back through the Montana countryside, Earl reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. "Your mother would be proud of us," he said. "Proud of what we've built, proud of the family we've chosen to become." Michael nodded, his eyes on the road ahead, but his heart finally at peace with the past. "Welcome home, Dad." Sometimes the greatest distances aren't measured in miles, but in years of silence between hearts that once beat as one. Earl and Michael's story reminds us that it's never too late to bridge the gaps that pride and pain have carved between us and those we love most. How many of us carry the weight of words unspoken, forgiveness withheld, or love unexpressed? In our golden years, we often realize that the grudges we've nursed and the walls we've built serve only to imprison our own hearts. Martha's final letter teaches us that love doesn't demand perfection. It simply asks us to show up, to be present, to choose connection over pride. The lions in this story found sanctuary not in hidden caves, but in the open hearts of people willing to start again. Just as Leah trusted Earl with her most precious cubs, we too can learn to trust again, to extend our hands across decades of hurt, and to believe that every ending can become a new beginning. Family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who stay, who fight for each other, and who refuse to let love die even when everything else falls apart. What relationship in your life needs the healing power of forgiveness? Have you ever discovered that a painful memory held hidden truths that changed everything? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.